Imagine waking up one morning and finding out your favorite smartphone just got more expensive, not because of a new feature or a fancy upgrade, but because of a political decision made thousands of miles away. For most of us, trade wars feel like something abstract, a tug-of-war between men in suits. But the truth is, it affects what we buy, how much we pay, and even where our jobs are headed. Today, we're diving into one of the most defining economic tensions of our time, the US-China trade war. A story that didn't start yesterday, but has been evolving quietly and sometimes loudly since 2018. Back then, President Trump launched a bold, and some might say risky strategy, imposing sweeping tariffs on Chinese imports. His aim? To reduce the trade deficit and push back against what he described as unfair trade practices by Beijing. China responded in kind, and just like that, the world's two largest economies were locked in a tit-for-tat battle. From soybeans to semiconductors, from washing machines to smartphones, the list of taxed goods only grew longer, and so did the global anxiety. Fast forward to today, 2025, and we're still feeling the aftershocks. But something new just happened. Recently, Trump announced a partial exemption for certain electronic goods. On the surface, it seemed like a step toward peace, a softening of tone. But Beijing wasn't buying it. They called it a small step. Not enough, not meaningful. A symbolic gesture perhaps, but far from a sign of real de-escalation. So, what's really going on here? Why now? And who actually benefits from this move? To answer that, we need to unpack the timeline, the strategies, and the quiet power plays behind these public headlines. Because as we'll see, this isn't just about tariffs anymore. It's about influence, control, and the shifting balance of global power. Let's take a closer look. Ever wondered why companies like Apple or Nvidia never seemed too shaken by the chaos of the trade war? Why their products still showed up on shelves, maybe a little pricier, but never out of reach? Here's where things get interesting. Behind the scenes, big tech didn't just sit back and hope for the best. They acted hard. Apple, for instance, lobbied the White House intensely in 2020 and again in 2024, arguing that tariffs on Chinese-made components would hurt not just them, but American innovation. And let's be honest, when Apple talks, Washington listens. Same goes for Nvidia, Dell, and others in the electronics sector. They pointed out that these tariffs weren't punishing China as much as they were punishing American design and R&D, since many of these devices are engineered here, but assembled abroad. It worked. That's why, even as tariffs hit a wide range of imports, a carve-out was made for electronics, arguably the most politically influential industry of the modern era. And while big tech breathed a sigh of relief, another unexpected group quietly celebrated. Southeast Asia. Countries like Vietnam and Malaysia have become surprise winners in this economic chess game. As companies began looking for alternatives to Chinese manufacturing, Vietnam's exports to the U.S. perked on, especially in electronics and machinery. In fact, between 2018 and 2023, Vietnam's electronics exports to the U.S. rose by over 50%. That's not a small shift. That's a reconfiguration of global supply chains. And from a strategic lens, it makes sense. Vietnam offers a young, skilled labor force, relatively low production costs, and a more stable relationship with the U.S. Malaysia too, has positioned itself as a reliable supplier, particularly in semiconductor packaging and testing. But not everyone has come out ahead. The American consumer, yes, all of us, have felt the pinch in quieter, more frustrating ways. Whether it's the price of a new laptop creeping up, or delays in getting your next-gen phone delivered, the effects are subtle but real. What's worse is the unpredictability. 1 month, a tariff exemption is granted. The next, it's gone. For families trying to budget or small businesses relying on imported tech to run their operations, this kind of volatility is more than an inconvenience, it's a risk. And I think that's where the conversation often misses the mark. It's not just about what's happening in boardrooms or foreign ministries, it's about what's happening in living rooms too. You might be a small business owner trying to upgrade your inventory, or a parent saving up for your kid's first laptop. These trade decisions ripple all the way to your daily life, and that deserves more attention. Now, with big tech playing its cards and Southeast Asia stepping into the spotlight, the question becomes, how is China responding? What tools does it have left? And are they working? Let's take a look. When we think of trade wars, we often picture tariffs. Simple, straightforward, and frankly, pretty blunt. But what if I told you that China's approach today is far more complex, subtle, and strategic than it was just a few years ago? In 2018, China largely mirrored U.S. actions. If Washington slapped on a 10% tariff, Beijing did the same. Dollar for dollar, product for product. But now, in 2025, it's clear that China has evolved. This isn't the same player it was back then. One of the most telling shifts has been China's use of non-tariff tools to influence outcomes. Export controls have become a powerful weapon. We've seen China limit the export of rare earth minerals, materials critical to everything from electric cars to military systems. That move wasn't just economic, it was symbolic. A reminder to the world that China controls over 60% of global rare earth processing, and it's willing to leverage that power. Then there's the cultural angle. Over the last year, several Hollywood films have been quietly pulled from release in the Chinese market. No official explanation, just radio silence. It may seem unrelated to trade, but these cultural bans send a strong message. Soft power, when denied, can sting. It impacts studios, investors, and even the perception of American culture abroad. And perhaps the most under-discussed tool is China's internal regulatory clampdowns on American firms operating in its market. From surprise audits to new data compliance laws, U.S. companies are finding it harder to navigate the Chinese business environment. These aren't headline-grabbing tariffs, but they're just as effective, if not more so, in pressuring negotiations and shifting leverage. Personally, I think this is where the U.S. may be underestimating the game. While Washington leans heavily on tariffs and public announcements, Beijing is playing a longer, quieter game. Less visible, but arguably more impactful. And this brings us to a really important contrast: the arsenal of the U.S. versus that of China. The U.S. tends to act through direct economic tools, tariffs, sanctions, and public legislation. It's fast and it gets attention. But it also invites immediate retaliation. China, on the other hand, has layered its response. It blends state-backed strategy with subtle restrictions, soft power denial, and long-term partnerships with other regions like Southeast Asia and the EU. It's not as flashy, but it's calculated. And that's something we should be paying closer attention to. It reminds me of a chess match. One player goes for bold, sweeping moves, the other slow and steady positioning. The game doesn't end with one hit. It's a series of calculated responses. And right now, both players are still setting up the board. So what does all this mean for the future of trade between these two superpowers? Well, it brings us to the next big piece of the puzzle: unpredictability, short-term deals, and why businesses everywhere are holding their breath. Let's explore that. What if the rules of your business changed every few weeks without warning? What if deals you depended on disappeared overnight, leaving you scrambling to make sense of the new landscape? That's the reality many American businesses are living in right now. The recent tariff exemptions granted by the U.S. for certain Chinese electronic imports were welcomed as a breath of fresh air. For companies relying on global supply chains, even a few months of reduced tariffs can mean the difference between breaking even and taking a loss. But here's the catch. These exemptions may only last 1 or 2 months. That's hardly enough time to make strategic decisions. Imagine you're a small U.S. electronics company. You finally find a reliable Chinese supplier, place a bulk order to restock for the holiday season, and start planning your pricing based on current tariff exemptions. Then, right before your shipment clears customs, the exemption expires. Suddenly, you're hit with a 15% import duty that wasn't in your cost forecast. Your profit margins shrink. Your pricing becomes uncompetitive. Your customers go elsewhere. That's not just inconvenient. That's destabilizing. And it's not just small businesses feeling the ripple effects. Investors, too, are losing confidence. When the rules of the game shift this frequently, it becomes nearly impossible to project earnings, allocate capital, or plan long-term. One small manufacturer I recently spoke to, let's call them Clear Tech Solutions, specializes in smart home devices. They've had to rewrite their supply contracts 3 times in the past year because of tariff uncertainties. At one point, they even paused a product launch because they couldn't predict what the landing cost would be for essential components. And here's what struck me the most. They weren't just worried about pain, they were worried about trust. Trust in the system. Trust in the idea that policy decisions would be stable enough for them to grow responsibly. This constant volatility doesn't just hurt business, it chips away at confidence. And when confidence goes, investment slows, innovation pauses, hiring freezes. It's a domino effect. I think we often underestimate how much businesses, especially small and mid-sized ones, crave predictability. They're not asking for zero risk. They're just asking for the rules to stay consistent long enough for them to plan. And honestly, as someone who's worked with startups and small firms, I get it. You can't build something meaningful if the ground keeps shifting under your feet. So the question becomes, if trade policy is this volatile, how are companies adapting? And more importantly, how is the global supply chain itself shifting to deal with the uncertainty? That takes us into our next chapter, the rise of Southeast Asia, the fear of product dumping, and whether true decoupling between the US and China is even possible. Let's dive in. It's easy to say we'll just move our supply chain, much harder to actually do it. For years, American companies have relied heavily on Chinese manufacturing, not just because it's cheap, but because it's efficient, well-established, and deeply integrated into global logistics. So when trade tensions escalated, the idea of decoupling became a buzzword. But now, years into this shift, we're starting to ask, is full decoupling even possible? Many companies have tried, some successfully. Others, not so much. We've seen big names like Apple start diversifying their assembly operations into places like Vietnam and India. Vietnam, in particular, has emerged as a key player in electronics and textiles. Between 2018 and 2023, U.S. imports of Vietnamese electronics grew by over 50%. That's a massive shift in just a few years. And it's not just multinationals. Smaller American firms are sourcing from Southeast Asia too, looking for more stable ground. But here's where it gets tricky. As more companies move production away from China, fears of product dumping are growing in other markets. What does that mean? Well, when goods that can no longer go to the U.S. are redirected elsewhere, often at discounted prices, it can flood local markets, disrupt pricing, and hurt domestic manufacturers. We've already seen early signs of this in places like the EU and Latin America, where complaints about underpriced Chinese electronics and machinery are starting to pile up. This isn't just an economic issue, it's a political one. Countries are now stuck in the middle, trying to maintain good relations with both superpowers while protecting their own markets. That's a tough spot to be in. Now back to the US and China. From the US side, decoupling is often discussed as a way to bring jobs back home or secure supply chains from geopolitical risks. But reshoring isn't as simple as flipping a switch. Labor costs, infrastructure gaps, and regulatory challenges make it difficult to relocate entire industries overnight. Plus, let's be real, consumers still want affordable products, and that often means global sourcing. On the other side, China isn't standing still. It's doubling down on trade relationships with Southeast Asia, Africa, and Europe. Beijing is actively investing in infrastructure, forging new supply routes through the Belt and Road Initiative, and offering incentives to global partners to keep business flowing, even if U.S. demand cools. So can you truly decouple? In my opinion, not fully. What we're seeing instead is a partial realignment, a rebalancing, a diversification of risk. Companies are spreading out their operations, not necessarily cutting ties with China, but making sure they're not overexposed to any one market. That's a smart move. It's less about isolation and more about flexibility. And maybe that's the real lesson here. In a world this interconnected, resilience comes from adaptability, not retreat. Which brings us to our next and equally complicated question. How are other countries responding to this shifting dynamic? Is anyone really neutral in a trade war of this scale? Let's unpack that next. We've talked a lot about trade routes, tariffs, and global strategy, but let's take a step back and ask a very basic, very human question. What about us? In all the noise of trade policy, the one thing that often gets left out is the American consumer. You and me, people trying to buy a phone for their kid, replace a broken laptop, start a side business from home. And here's the uncomfortable truth. There is no clear plan in place to protect American consumers from the fallout of this trade war. Sure, politicians talk about protecting American jobs and standing tough on China, and those are important goals. But in the meantime, prices on essential electronics have gone up. Product availability has become unpredictable, and for many households, inflation, already a real struggle, gets an extra push from these trade tensions. What's frustrating is that there's very little transparency about how these decisions are made or who they're really for. Are we negotiating from a place of long-term vision? Or are these exemptions and tariffs just political moves timed around elections? It's hard to say. One thing that stands out to me is how little domestic political discussion we're actually hearing around this issue. Yes, Trump's policies are back in the spotlight, especially with his recent reemergence. But there's not much conversation happening in Congress. No deep debates about how trade policy should evolve. No real acknowledgement of how these battles are affecting everyday Americans. Even among U.S. economists and trade experts, the silence is striking. We're not seeing a lot of detailed analysis in the mainstream media. We're not getting consistent insight from officials on what the plan is, or even if there is a plan. And honestly, that worries me. As someone who's worked closely with small businesses and middle-class families, I know how much people depend on clear information. Not just policy headlines, but real explanations, real strategy, real care. Because when there's a vacuum in leadership or communication, it leaves space for uncertainty and fear. That's why I believe we need more honest conversations about what this trade war really means, not just for markets and economies, but for people. People trying to make ends meet, people planning their futures, people who just want stability in an already uncertain world. And perhaps the biggest takeaway here is this. When we only talk about trade in terms of strategy, we forget that every strategy touches lives. Which brings us to a powerful final question. What are the lessons we can take from all this? Not just to understand the trade war, but to navigate the world it's shaping. Let's talk about that next. So after all the tariffs, tensions, shifting supply chains, and political grandstanding, what now? Where do we go from here? Because let's be honest, this trade war isn't a chapter that's closing, it's the new normal. And whether you're a business owner, an investor, or just someone trying to plan your family's finances, the question becomes, how do you navigate a world shaped by trade conflict? For American businesses, especially small and mid-sized ones, there are some hard-earned lessons to take forward. First and foremost, don't build your house on unstable ground. Relying too heavily on one country or one policy exemption is a gamble. And as we've seen, even a temporary exemption can disappear with the stroke of a pen. One company I worked with, a family-run import business dealing in smart appliances, had a great thing going with a supplier in Shenzhen. But when tariffs hit and then exemptions came and went like the wind, their margins collapsed. What saved them wasn't a new policy, it was their pivot to diversify sourcing across Thailand and Mexico. It wasn't easy, it wasn't fast, but it gave them breathing room and options. So if you're a business owner, the big takeaway here is agility beats loyalty. Being nimble, having multiple suppliers, and keeping a pulse on international developments is no longer optional. It's survival. For consumers, the lesson is subtler, but no less important. Trade policy might feel distant, but it's not. It touches what you buy, how much you pay, and what's available when you need it. Paying attention, even just a little more than usual, can help you make smarter choices, whether that's when to buy, where to buy, or even what brands are best prepared to weather volatility. And here's something I feel strongly about. We can't wait for perfect stability to make smart moves. Global markets are going to be turbulent. Geopolitics will keep shifting. Leaders will change and policies will swing back and forth. But our response doesn't have to be passive. Whether it's in business or in life, those who thrive in uncertain times are the ones who prepare for change, not just react to it. Now, I know that's easier said than done, especially for those of you who've been through the 2008 crash or felt the tremors of COVID-19 supply chain disruptions. You know how quickly stability can turn into chaos, but you also know the power of resilience. You've built it before, and you can build it again. And maybe that's what gives me hope. Yes, this trade war is messy. Yes, it's frustrating, but it's also pushing us, businesses, governments, everyday people, to think smarter, act quicker, and adapt better. So as we move forward, let's carry that mindset with us. Eyes open, plans flexible, and always ready for what's next. Let's recap what we've uncovered. From shifting tariffs and short-lived exemptions to new weapons in China's trade arsenal, today's trade war isn't just a battle of economics. It's a high-stakes game of strategy and survival. We saw how big tech adapts, how Southeast Asia seizes the moment, and how American consumers are left questioning the real cost. We also asked the tough questions. Is decoupling really happening? Can businesses make long-term decisions in such an unstable environment? And perhaps most importantly, who's missing from the conversation and why? So what can you do with all this? If you're a business owner, start thinking beyond tariff deadlines. Build supply chain flexibility now. If you're a consumer, understand how policy shapes the prices you pay and the choices you're given. If you're a policymaker or analyst, consider what voices are being left out and what that silence could mean. Trade is no longer just about money, it's about power, resilience, and foresight. What do you think the US or China should do next? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit that like button if you found value, and subscribe for more deep dives into the global forces shaping our world. This conversation is just getting started.